A millionaire invites his fiancée to dinner. Unexpectedly, he runs into his ex-wife working at the restaurant. She was a waitress and pregnant. The shock of seeing her in such a situation brought back all his feelings. Before you hear this emotional story, make sure to subscribe to the channel. The sun had barely risen when Emily opened her eyes, feeling the weight of the world on her small shoulders. At 12 years old, she already carried responsibilities that many adults couldn't bear. The room was silent, except for the soft snoring of the twins, Michael and Sophie, her newborn siblings. Emily observed them for a moment, their angelic faces contrasting with the harsh reality that surrounded them. Careful not to wake them, she got up from the makeshift bed on the floor. The tiny, dilapidated apartment they called home was a constant reminder of how drastically their lives had changed in recent months. The peeling walls and musty smells seemed to suffocate any hope that remained. Emily walked silently to the kitchen, her bare feet skillfully avoiding the creaking floorboards. She opened the refrigerator, even knowing what she would find. Empty shelves except for an almost expired carton of milk and some leftovers that would barely make a meal. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten properly in days. As she prepared the bottles for the twins with the little milk that remained, Emily couldn't help but think of her mother. Tears threatened to fall, but she held them back. She couldn't afford to cry now. The babies needed her to be strong. The loss of her mother just 3 months ago had been the trigger for the collapse of their lives. Her father, already prone to drinking, had completely sunk into alcohol after the tragedy. From the family provider, he had transformed into a bitter and violent man, spending what little money they had on drinks and gambling. A noise coming from the room next door made Emily freeze. Her heart raced when she heard her father's heavy, stumbling footsteps. She knew what was coming next. It was a painful routine that repeated almost every morning. The door opened with a bang, and Carl, her father, appeared. His eyes were red and swollen, the foul breath of alcohol filling the air. He looked at Emily, with a mixture of contempt and anger. "Where's the money?" he growled, his voice hoarse and threatening. Emily swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. "There's no money, Dad. We spent the last on diapers for the twins yesterday." Carl's expression contorted in fury. He lunged forward, grabbing Emily by the arm hard enough to leave marks. "You liar! You're hiding it from me!" Emily struggled to break free, fear growing in her chest. "Please, Dad, I swear I don't have anything. Please, you're hurting." Before she could finish, Carl pushed her hard. Emily fell, hitting her head on the corner of the table. Pain exploded in her temple, and for a moment everything went blurry. The twins' cries filled the apartment, awakened by the commotion. Carl cursed loudly, covering his ears. "Shut those damn babies up." Emily got up, stumbling, positioning herself between her father and the room where the twins were. "I'll take care of them, Dad. Please, go rest." For a moment it seemed Carl would attack her again, but then he simply grunted, grabbed his tattered jacket and left, slamming the door behind him. Emily ran to the twins, picking them up and trying to calm them. As she rocked them, a decision began to form in her mind. They couldn't continue like this. The situation was getting worse every day, and she feared what might happen if they stayed. With tears in her eyes but with newfound determination, Emily began to plan. They needed to run away. It was risky, she knew, but staying seemed even more dangerous. As she fed the twins with the bottles she had prepared, her mind raced, thinking about how they could escape and where they would go. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of frantic and silent activity. Emily packed what little they had, some clothes, diapers, the remaining powdered milk, and the few savings she had managed to hide from her father. Everything fit into a single old backpack. When afternoon came, Emily looked out the window, observing the busy street below. The world out there seemed vast and scary, but it also offered the promise of a new beginning. She took a deep breath, trying to gather all the courage she possessed. "Come on, Michael and Sophie," she whispered to the twins who looked at her with their big, innocent eyes. "Let's find a better place for us." With the babies secure in an improvised stroller and the backpack on her back, Emily opened the apartment door. She hesitated for a moment, looking back one last time. This place, despite everything, was the only home she knew, But she knew that a true home wasn't a place, but the people she loved. And now, her home was Michael and Sophie. With one last sigh, Emily closed the door behind her. The dark hallway of the building seemed endless, but each step took her away from danger and she hoped towards a better future. Carefully descending the stairs, Emily tried not to think too much about what she was leaving behind or the challenges they would certainly face. She focused only on the next step, the next breath, the next moment. Upon reaching the street, the noise and movement of the city hit her like a wave. Cars honking, people talking, the distant sound of a siren. Everything seemed amplified. Emily felt small and vulnerable, but also strangely free. "Where do we go?" she muttered to herself, looking both ways down the street. She didn't have a concrete plan, just the certainty that they needed to get as far away as possible. Deciding on a direction, Emily began to walk. Each step took her further from the apartment, from her father, from the life she knew. But it also took her toward the unknown, toward an uncertain future, but one full of possibilities. The city streets stretched out before her, a labyrinth of concrete and hope. Emily knew that the challenges they would face would be enormous. 3 children alone in the big city with no money, no certain destination. But looking at Michael and Sophie asleep in the stroller, she felt a wave of determination. "We'll be okay," she promised quietly, more to herself than to the twins. "I'll take care of you no matter what happens." The sun was starting to set when Emily realized they had been walking for hours. The familiar streets of her neighborhood had long since been left behind, replaced by unknown avenues and imposing buildings that seemed to touch the sky. Michael and Sophie slept peacefully in the improvised stroller, oblivious to the uncertain journey they were undertaking. Emily felt her arms aching from pushing the stroller and her legs tired from the long walk. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since morning. But the determination in her eyes didn't waver. Each step was a step away from danger, away from her father's violent hands and the apartment that had long ceased to be a home. The city lights began to come on, painting the streets with an artificial glow that both fascinated and frightened Emily. She had never been alone on the street at night, much less with 2 babies in her care. The reality of her situation began to weigh on her young shoulders. "Where do we go now?" she muttered to herself, observing the people around her. Hurried executives returning home, couples holding hands, groups of friends laughing loudly. Everyone seemed to have a place to go, a certain destination. Everyone except her. It was then that Emily spotted a park across the street. It was a green oasis amid the city's concrete, with leafy trees and wooden benches that looked inviting. She decided it would be a good place to rest and rethink her next steps. Carefully, she crossed the busy street, keeping her eyes alert to cars and protecting the stroller with her body. Upon reaching the park, she immediately felt calmer. The noise of the city seemed to diminish there, muffled by the trees and the soft sound of a nearby fountain. Emily found a bench partially hidden by bushes and decided it would be a good place to spend the night. It wasn't ideal, she knew, but it was the best she could do at the moment. Carefully, she settled Michael and Sophie, still asleep, on the bench, using the backpack as an improvised pillow. Sitting next to her siblings, Emily finally allowed herself to relax a little. The tears she had held back all day began to flow, silently. She cried for the mother she had lost, for the father who had become a stranger, for the childhood that had been stolen from her. But mostly she cried for the uncertain future that awaited her and the twins. "Mum," she whispered to the starry sky that was beginning to appear, "what do I do now?" As if in response, Sophie began to whimper. Emily quickly dried her tears and turned her attention to her sister. "Shh, it's okay, Sophie, I'm here." Picking up the baby, Emily realized she needed to be changed. With a sigh, she opened the backpack and took out one of the few diapers they had brought. As she cared for Sophie, her mind worked furiously, trying to devise a plan. They needed food, a safe place to sleep, and eventually, help. But who would help 3 children alone? Emily knew that if the authorities found them, they would probably be separated and sent to different foster homes. The idea of losing Michael and Sophie made her heart clench. I won't let that happen, she promised quietly, hugging Sophie to her chest. We'll stay together no matter what. The night wore on and the park became increasingly empty. Emily fought against sleep, determined to stay alert to protect her siblings. Every sound made her jump, imagining her father or police coming after them. It was then that she heard footsteps approaching. Her heart raced and she instinctively bent over the twins, trying to hide them with her body. The footsteps got closer, and Emily held her breath. "Hello?" a gentle voice called out. "Is anyone there?" Emily hesitated, torn between fear and hope that it might be someone willing to help. Slowly, she raised her head. A middle-aged woman was standing a few feet away, holding a shopping bag. Her eyes widened when she saw Emily and the babies. "Oh my God, are you okay?" the woman asked, taking a step forward. Emily didn't respond immediately, still unsure about trusting this stranger. The woman seemed to understand her hesitation. "My name is Sarah," she said softly. "I work at the homeless shelter nearby. Do you need help?" The words shelter and help made Emily falter. Part of her wanted to trust, to accept the offer of assistance. But the fear of being separated still dominated her. "We're fine," Emily finally replied, her trembling voice betraying her insecurity. "We're just resting for a bit." Sarah looked at her with a mixture of concern and understanding. "I see, but it's not safe to stay here at night, especially with babies. The shelter has family rooms. You could spend the night there, have a hot meal." The mention of food made Emily's stomach audibly growl. Sarah smiled gently. "Look, you don't have to decide now. How about coming with me just to eat? Something? No commitment. If you want to leave afterwards, that's fine." Emily bit her lip, considering the offer. Her protective instinct screamed not to trust anyone, to run away. But the reality of their situation, hunger, fatigue, the cold that was starting to set in, spoke louder. After a long moment, Emily slowly nodded. "Okay, just to eat." Sarah's smile widened. "Great, the shelter is just 2 blocks from here. Can I help with the stroller?" Reluctantly, Emily allowed Sarah to hold one side of the stroller as they walked. The journey was made in silence, Emily constantly looking around, ready to flee at the slightest sign of danger. When they arrived at the shelter, Emily was surprised. It wasn't the dark and scary place she had imagined, but a well-maintained building with welcoming lights shining through the windows. "Welcome," Sarah said, opening the door. "Let's go in and get something for you to eat." Emily hesitated on the threshold, fear fighting against need. She looked at Michael and Sophie, still asleep, and then at Sarah, who waited patiently. With a deep sigh, Emily took a step forward, entering the shelter. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, the promise of a hot meal and a roof over their heads was all she could ask for. As she followed Sarah down the lit hallway, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Maybe this was the first step towards a better life for her and her siblings. The smell of home-cooked food filled the air, making Emily's stomach growl again. Sarah led her to a cozy room, where other families were seated at tables, sharing meals and quiet conversations. "I'll get something for you to eat," Sarah said with a gentle smile. "Why don't you settle over there?" She pointed to an empty table, in the corner. Emily nodded, still cautious but grateful for the kindness. Carefully, she maneuvered the stroller to the indicated table, checking on the twins once more. Michael was starting to stir, probably sensing the smell of food. As she waited, Emily observed the other people in the dining room. There were entire families, single mothers with children, and even some elderly individuals. Everyone looked tired. But there was an air of relief on their faces, as if this place represented a safe harbor in the midst of a storm. Sarah returned with a tray loaded with food, a steaming plate of pasta with sauce, fresh bread, and even a small salad. There were also 2 prepared bottles for the twins. "Here you go," she said, placing the tray on the table. "Eat as much as you want. There's more if you need it." Emily felt tears forming in her eyes, moved by the first genuine display of kindness she had experienced in months. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Sarah smiled, gently placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "You don't need to thank me, dear. That's what we're here for. She paused as if carefully considering her next words. "When you're done eating, we can talk about how we can help you and your little siblings, okay? No pressure, just a conversation." Emily nodded, still unable to speak. Sarah gave one last encouraging smile before moving away to help other newcomers. Alone at the table, Emily looked at the food in front of her, then at Michael and Sophie, who were now both awake and restless. With a deep sigh, she picked up Michael, offering him the bottle. As she fed the twins, Emily allowed herself, for the first time since leaving home, to relax a little. The warmth of the shelter, the smell of food, and Sarah's kindness had created a temporary bubble of safety. She knew there was still a long road ahead, that this meal and this moment of peace were just the beginning. But for the first time in a long time, Emily felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had found a place where they could start over. As she ate slowly, savoring each bite, Emily observed the people around her. She saw smiles exchanged between strangers, heard words of comfort being shared, witnessed small acts of kindness that seemed to illuminate the environment. And there, on that night in the shelter, surrounded by strangers who seemed willing to help, Emily began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the future wasn't as scary as it seemed. That maybe there was a place for her and her siblings in this vast and often cruel world. With a full stomach and the twins asleep again, Emily allowed herself a small smile. Tomorrow was still uncertain, but at least for tonight, they were safe. And for now, that was enough. Dawn arrived silently at the shelter, its first rays of light creeping through the windows and gently touching Emily's sleeping face. She opened her eyes slowly, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar environment. Then memories of the previous night flooded her mind. The escape, the park, Sarah, the shelter. Emily sat up quickly, her heart racing as she searched for Michael and Sophie. She sighed in relief when she saw them sleeping peacefully in an improvised crib next to her bed. Sarah had insisted they spend the night at the shelter, assuring Emily that no one would bother them and that they would be safe. Despite the relative comfort of the bed and the sense of security provided by the shelter's walls, Emily had barely slept. Her mind was filled with worries about the future and painful memories of the past. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's anger-contorted face, heard the screams, felt the fear. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Emily," Sarah's gentle voice called. "Can I come in?" "Yes," Emily replied, her voice still hoarse from sleep. Sarah entered carrying a tray with breakfast. The smell of fresh bread and coffee filled the small room, making Emily's stomach involuntarily growl. "Good morning," Sarah smiled, placing the tray on the small table beside the bed. "I hope you managed to get some rest." Emily nodded, still a bit distrustful but grateful for the kindness. "Thank you," she murmured, taking a cup of hot milk. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her face expressing a mixture of concern and compassion. "Emily," she began softly, "I know you must be scared and confused, but we're here to help. You can trust us." Emily lowered her eyes, fighting against the tears that threatened to fall. Part of her desperately wanted to trust, to share the burden she carried, but the fear of losing her siblings, of being separated, still paralyzed her. I can't," she finally whispered. "If we tell the truth, they'll separate us. I can't lose Michael and Sophie. They're all I have left." Sarah sighed, understanding the depth of Emily's fear. "I understand your fear, dear, but running away isn't the solution. You need help, a stable home, adults who can properly care for you." Sarah's words, though gentle, made Emily feel even more desperate. "I can take care of them," she insisted, her voice trembling. "We just need a place to stay, maybe a job. I can do this." Sarah looked at Emily with a mixture of admiration and sadness. "You're incredibly strong and brave, Emily. What you've done to protect your siblings is remarkable. But you're also a child. You deserve to have a childhood. Go to school, play. And Michael and Sophie need care that you alone can't provide." Sarah's words hit Emily like a punch to the stomach. Deep down, she knew Sarah was right. The last 24 hours had shown how unprepared she was to care for two children on the streets. But the idea of giving up, of handing over control to strangers, was terrifying. "What will happen to us?" Emily asked, her voice almost a whisper. Sarah moved closer, placing a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "First, we'll make sure you're safe and well cared for. We have social workers who can help find the best solution for all three of you. The goal is always to keep families together, if possible." Emily absorbed Sarah's words, her heart torn between fear and a faint hope. At that moment, Michael began to whimper, waking from his sleep. Emily immediately got up to pick him up, her maternal instincts overriding any other concern. Sarah silently observed as Emily calmed Michael, murmuring sweet words and gently rocking him. The love and care Emily had for her siblings was evident. "You're a great sister, Emily," Sarah said softly. "Michael and Sophie are lucky to have you. But all three of you deserve more than just surviving. You deserve a chance to thrive." Emily looked at Sarah, her eyes full of unshed tears. "I'm afraid," she finally admitted. "What if they separate us? What if my father finds us?" The mention of her father made Sarah frown. "Emily, your father, did he hurt you?" Emily hesitated, but something in Sarah's gentle expression made her feel she could trust her. Slowly, she nodded. Since she was gone, he changed. He drinks a lot. He gets violent." Sarah took a deep breath, controlling her own emotion at the revelation. "Thank you for telling me, Emily. This is very important. I promise we'll do everything we can to keep you safe and together." At that moment, Sophie also woke up, her cries joining Michael's. Sarah stood up. "I'll go get the bottles for them. Why don't we have breakfast together and talk more? No pressure, just to better understand how we can help." Emily nodded, grateful for Sarah's kindness and patience. As the woman left the room, Emily looked at the twins, her heart overflowing with love and concern. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, more to herself than to the babies. "We'll stay together, I promise." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of conversations, tears, and surprisingly, even some moments of laughter. Sarah introduced Emily to Dr. Richard, a kind social worker who asked questions about her family situation, always careful not to push too hard. As Emily shared more details about her life, the loss of her mother, her father's alcoholism, the months of neglect and abuse, she felt as if a huge weight was being lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone with her secrets and fears. "Emily," Dr. Richard said gently after hearing her story, "you've shown incredible courage, but now it's time to let adults help. We'll do everything we can to keep you and your siblings together and safe." The promise of help, of safety, was almost too much for Emily to absorb. Part of her still wanted to run, to protect the twins from the world. But another part, a part that grew with each moment spent in the shelter, longed to be a child again, to have someone taking care of her too. As the day progressed, Emily observed the other children in the shelter. Some were playing, others reading or drawing. All seemed to have found a moment of peace amid their own storms. Seeing this, Emily felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. In the afternoon, Sarah brought news that made Emily's heart leap. "We found a foster family willing to take all three of you," she announced with a smile. "It's an experienced couple who have cared for many children. They have a spacious house in the suburbs with a large backyard. And most importantly, they're willing to take you and the twins together." Emily was speechless, a mix of emotions flooding her. Relief, hope, but also fear of the unknown. Can we meet them first?" she asked hesitantly. "Of course," Sarah assured her. "In fact, they'd like to come here tomorrow to meet you if that's okay." Emily nodded, feeling a wave of nervousness and anticipation. This could be the chance for a new beginning, a better life for her and her siblings. That night, lying in the shelter bed with Michael and Sophie sleeping peacefully beside her, Emily reflected on everything that had happened in the last few days. The desperate escape, the fear on the streets, the unexpected kindness of strangers. Looking at the sleeping faces of her siblings, Emily made a silent promise. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "I don't know what the future holds for us, but I promise I'll always be here for you. Always." With that comforting thought, Emily finally allowed herself to relax completely for the first time in months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, New faces, perhaps even a new home. But for now, in this moment of calm, Emily allowed herself to dream of possibilities. As sleep enveloped her, a small smile played on her lips. The future, once so frightening, now seemed to shine with a light of hope, and Emily was ready to embrace it. No longer alone, but with the support and care that she and her siblings so deserved. The sun had barely risen when Emily woke up, her heart beating fast with the prospect of the day ahead. Today, she and the twins would meet the family that could become their new temporary home. The mixture of anxiety and hope she felt was almost palpable. Sitting on the bed, Emily observed Michael and Sophie still asleep. Their angelic little faces, free of worries, contrasted with the whirlwind of emotions she was experiencing. What would this new family be like? Would they really be kind and understanding, as Sarah had said? And more importantly, could they trust them? A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Sarah, bringing breakfast and a warm smile. "Good morning, Emily," she greeted, placing the tray on the small table. "How are you feeling today?" Emily shrugged, unable to put into words the whirlwind of emotions she felt. Sarah, noticing her hesitation, sat down next to her on the bed. "It's normal to be nervous," she said gently. "But remember, we're here to help. The Johnson family is very experienced and loving. I'm sure you'll get along well." Emily nodded, picking up a cup of hot chocolate from the tray. The warmth of the drink seemed to calm her nerves a bit. "What are they like?" she asked timidly. Sarah smiled. "Well, Mr. David Johnson is a music teacher at a local school. Mrs. Lisa Johnson is a pediatric nurse. They have a 14-year-old adopted daughter, Lucy. They're wonderful people who have fostered several children over the years." Emily absorbed the information, trying to imagine what it would be like to live with this family. A small spark of hope began to grow in her chest. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparations. Emily bathed the twins, dressed them in the best clothes they had, donated by the shelter, and tried to tame her own rebellious hair. She wanted to make a good first impression, even though part of her still feared getting too attached to this possibility. Shortly before noon, Sarah appeared again, her face lit up with an emotional smile. "They're here, Emily. They're waiting in the visiting room. Are you ready?" Emily took a deep breath, looking at Michael and Sophie in her arms. "I think so," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. With hesitant steps, Emily followed Sarah through the shelter corridors. Each step seemed to echo in her ears, amplifying her anxiety. Finally, they reached a closed door. Sarah gave one last encouraging smile before opening it. The visiting room was cozy, with comfortable sofas and toys scattered in a corner. But Emily's eyes were immediately drawn to the couple sitting on the main sofa. Mr. Johnson was a middle-aged man with a gentle smile and kind eyes behind thin-framed glasses. Beside him, Mrs. Johnson emanated an aura of calm and affection, her face lighting up at the sight of the children. Between them, a teenager, whom Emily presumed to be Lucy, observed with curiosity and a shy smile. "Emily, Michael, Sophie," Sarah introduced. "Meet David, Lisa, and Lucy Johnson." There was a moment of silence, broken only by Sophie's soft babbling. Then, Mrs. Johnson stood up, slowly approaching with outstretched hands. "Hello, dears," she said, her voice soft and comforting. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." Emily, still holding the twins protectively, took a small step forward. "Hi," she murmured, her voice trembling. Mr. Johnson joined his wife, his warm smile never faltering. "We know you must be scared, Emily," he said gently, "but we want you to know that we're here to help. Not to replace your family, but to offer a safe home for as long as you need." Something in the sincerity of his words made Emily relax a little. She looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly, and then back at the Johnsons. You really want all three of us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It was Lucy who answered, taking a step forward with a warm smile. "Of course, I've always wanted little siblings, and now it looks like I'm getting three at once." The spontaneity and enthusiasm of Lucy broke the tension in the room. Emily couldn't help but give a small smile, the first genuine one in days. The next few hours passed in a mixture of conversations, laughter, and to Emily's surprise, moments of true connection. Mr. Johnson charmed Michael with a lullaby played on a small guitar he had brought. Mrs. Johnson, with her experience as a nurse, gave valuable tips on how to care for the twins, and Lucy, excited about the prospect of having siblings, couldn't stop talking about all the places she wanted to show Emily. As the day progressed, Emily felt the walls she had built around her heart begin to crumble. She watched, amazed, as the Johnsons interacted not only with the twins, but also with her. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel like a child again, not carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. When it was time for the Johnsons to leave, Emily felt a pang of sadness. Part of her wanted to go with them immediately, to escape to this new world of possibilities they represented. "We'll be back tomorrow," Mrs. Johnson promised, gently hugging Emily. "And if everything goes well with the paperwork, you can come home with us in a few days." Emily nodded, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. After the Johnsons left, Emily sat in the visiting room with Sarah, the sleeping twins in her lap. "So," Sarah asked softly, "what did you think?" Emily was silent for a moment, processing everything that had happened. "They seem good," she finally answered. "Kind, like a real family." Sarah smiled, placing a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "They are, dear. And remember, this isn't the end of your journey, it's just a new chapter. The Johnsons are here to help, to give you a safe home while we work to resolve your permanent situation." Emily nodded, feeling a mixture of hope and apprehension. "And if my father finds us?" Sarah's expression turned serious. "Don't worry about that now, Emily. We're taking all necessary precautions. Your safety and that of the twins is our #1 priority." That night, lying in the shelter bed, Emily reflected on the day. The images of the Johnsons' warm smiles, the sound of Mr. Johnson's music, Lucy's excitement, all mixed in her mind, creating a tapestry of hope. Looking at Michael and Sophie, sleeping peacefully beside her, Emily felt a wave of determination. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something good. A chance to have a normal childhood, to see her siblings grow up in an environment of love and safety. "We're going to be okay," she whispered to the twins, a promise to them as much as to herself. "I think we've finally found people who really care." With that comforting thought, Emily closed her eyes, allowing herself to dream of a brighter future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, no doubt, but for the first time in a long time she felt truly hopeful. And so, lulled by the soft sound of the twins' breathing and the warmth of hope in her heart, Emily fell asleep, dreaming of better days to come. The day dawned with a promise of change. Emily woke up early, her heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and expectation. Today was the day she and the twins would go to the Johnsons' home. After days of preparations, conversations with social workers and supervised visits, the time had finally come to take this big step. As she packed the small backpack with the few belongings they had, Emily couldn't help but feel a pang of fear. The shelter, despite all its limitations, had become a safe haven. The idea of leaving it behind, of venturing into the unknown once again, was scary. Sarah entered the room, her face lit up with an encouraging smile. "Ready for the big day, Emily?" Emily shrugged, unable to express in words the whirlwind of emotions she felt. Sarah, understanding as always, sat down beside her on the bed. "It's normal to be nervous," she said softly, "but remember, this is a wonderful opportunity for you and the twins. The Johnsons are incredible people, and they're eager to welcome you." Emily nodded, picking up Sophie while Sarah helped with Michael. "And if it doesn't work out?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "Then we'll be here to help. This isn't the end of the journey, Emily. It's just a new chapter, and we'll be following closely, ensuring that you're safe and happy." Sarah's words brought some comfort, but the nervousness persisted. As they walked through the shelter corridors towards the exit, Emily felt as if she were leaving behind more than just a place. She was leaving behind a part of her life, embarking on something completely new and unknown. At the shelter entrance, the Johnsons waited with warm smiles. Mr. Johnson immediately offered to carry the backpack, while Mrs. Johnson approached to help with the twins. Lucy, excited as always, couldn't stop talking about all the plans she had for when they got home. "We have a room all prepared for you," she said, her eyes shining with excitement. "Mom even painted the walls a light blue like the sky." Emily tried to smile, but the lump in her throat made it difficult to respond. She cast one last look at the shelter, at Sarah waving from the door, before getting into the Johnsons' car. The trip to the Johnsons' house was a mixture of contemplative silence and soft conversations. Mr. Johnson occasionally pointed out interesting places through the window, while Mrs. Johnson maintained a calm conversation, clearly trying to make Emily feel at ease. When they finally arrived, Emily was impressed. The Johnsons' house was spacious and welcoming, with a large front garden full of colorful flowers. Lucy practically jumped out of the car, eager to show everything to Emily. "Come on, come see your room," she exclaimed, gently taking Emily's hand and pulling her along. The room was more beautiful than Emily could have imagined. The walls were indeed a soft blue, decorated with cloud and bird stickers. There was a comfortable bed for her and 2 new cribs for the twins. In one corner, a bookshelf full of books and toys waited to be explored. "Do you like it?" Mrs. Johnson asked softly, entering the room with Michael in her arms. Emily nodded, speechless. It was more than she had ever had, more than she had ever dreamed of having. The reality of the situation began to sink in, bringing with it a wave of emotions that she struggled to contain. The rest of the day passed in a blur of new experiences. Lunch was a delicious home-cooked meal, something Emily hadn't experienced in months. Mr. Johnson showed her the small music studio in the basement, promising to teach her to play an instrument if she wanted. Mrs. Johnson patiently guided her through the twins' routine, showing where the diapers, clothes, and food were. At night, after a quiet dinner and a relaxing bath, Emily found herself lying in her new bed, the twins sleeping peacefully in the cribs beside her. The silence of the house was different from the shelter, deeper, more personal. She could hear the soft clinking of dishes being washed in the kitchen, the distant sound of a television somewhere in the house. It was in this moment, alone with her thoughts, that the emotions finally overflowed. Emily began to cry silently, tears of relief, fear, hope, and longing mixing on her pillow. A soft knock on the door made her swallow her sobs. Mrs. Johnson entered quietly, her face a mask of concern when she saw Emily's tears. "Oh dear," she murmured, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Is everything okay?" Emily tried to speak, but the words got stuck in her throat. Mrs. Johnson, with a gentleness that reminded Emily of her mother, pulled her into a hug. "I know it's a lot to process," she said softly, stroking Emily's hair. "You must be missing your mom, aren't you?" Emily nodded against Mrs. Johnson's shoulder, the tears now flowing freely. I just wish she was here," she sobbed, "that none of this had happened." Mrs. Johnson hugged her tighter. "I know, dear, I know. Your mum would be so proud of you, Emily. You're so strong, so brave. And although we can't replace your mum, we want you to know that you're safe here, that you can be just a child again." Mrs. Johnson's words touched something deep in Emily. For the first time since her mother had passed, she allowed herself to be truly vulnerable, letting all the pain, fear, and exhaustion of the past few months flow. They stayed like this for a long time, Mrs. Johnson holding Emily as she cried, murmuring words of comfort and stroking her hair. Gradually, Emily's sobs subsided, replaced by a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. "Better?" Mrs. Johnson asked softly, pulling back a little to look into Emily's eyes. Emily nodded, wiping away the last tears. "I'm sorry for—" "Shh," Mrs. Johnson gently interrupted her. "There's nothing to apologize for. It's perfectly normal to feel this way. We're here for you, Emily, for whatever you need." At that moment, as if sensing the emotion in the air, Sophie began to whimper in her crib. Emily made a move to get up, but Mrs. Johnson stopped her with a smile. "Let me handle this tonight," she said. "You rest. Tomorrow is a new day, a new beginning." Emily watched with a mixture of gratitude and admiration as Mrs. Johnson skillfully calmed Sophie, changed her diaper, and put her back to sleep. There was a naturalness to her movements, a gentleness that made Emily feel safe. When Sophie was back asleep, Mrs. Johnson turned to Emily with a warm smile. "Try to get some sleep, dear, and remember, we're just down the hall if you need anything." Emily nodded, feeling fatigue finally settle over her. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice heavy with sincerity. Mrs. Johnson smiled, leaning down to give Emily a soft kiss on the forehead. "Good night, dear, sleep well." As the door closed softly behind Mrs. Johnson, Emily snuggled under the covers. The room, which had seemed strange and intimidating not long ago, now emanated a sense of comfort and safety. Looking at the cribs where Michael and Sophie slept peacefully, Emily felt a wave of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had found a true home, a place where they could be children again, where they could grow surrounded by love and care. With that comforting thought, Emily closed her eyes, letting herself be lulled by the welcoming silence of the house. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, no doubt, but for the first time in a long time she felt truly hopeful. And so, cradled by the promise of better days, Emily fell asleep, dreaming of a future full of possibilities. The days that followed were an emotional roller coaster for Emily. Each morning brought with it a mixture of expectation and apprehension as she tried to adjust to her new reality in the Johnsons' home. The daily routine was very different from what Emily was used to. There was no longer a need to wake up before dawn to take care of the twins alone. Now she was gently awakened by the aroma of fresh coffee and the soft sound of music coming from the kitchen. In the first week, Emily still found herself waking up startled in the middle of the night, her body programmed to check on the babies. But invariably she would find Mrs. Johnson already there, cradling one of the twins or changing a diaper with the skill of years of experience. "Go back to sleep, dear," Mrs. Johnson would always say with a gentle smile. "You deserve to rest." Those words, so simple, still made Emily's heart clench. It was hard for her to accept that she no longer needed to carry all the weight alone, that there were trustworthy adults to share the responsibility. Mornings at the Johnsons' house were lively. Mr. Johnson prepared breakfast for everyone, filling the kitchen with the smell of pancakes and scrambled eggs. Lucy, always energetic, chatted about her plans for the day while helping to set the table. Emily observed everything with a mixture of fascination and nostalgia. Was this how a family breakfast should be? Was this how her own family could have been if things had been different? One day, while helping Mrs. Johnson wash the dishes after breakfast, Emily finally found the courage to ask the question that had been stuck in her throat for days. "Mrs. Johnson," she began hesitantly, "why do you do this? Why do you take in children you don't even know?" Mrs. Johnson paused what she was doing, turning to look Emily in the eyes. Her face softened with an understanding smile. "Emily, dear, we do this because we believe every child deserves a safe and loving home," she explained gently. "David and I always wanted a big family, but we couldn't have more children after Lucy. So we decided to open our hearts and our home to children who need a place to call home, even if temporarily." Emily absorbed the words, feeling a wave of emotion. "But what if we cause trouble? What if we're not what you expected?" Mrs. Johnson placed her hands on Emily's shoulders, her gaze full of affection. "Emily, you and your siblings are exactly what we expected. Brave, strong children full of love to give. There's nothing you could do that would make us give up on you, understand?" Mrs. Johnson's words hit Emily like a warm embrace, making her eyes fill with tears. She nodded, unable to speak, and let herself be enveloped in a comforting hug. As the days passed, Emily began to feel more at ease in the Johnsons' home. She discovered that Mr. Johnson had a special talent for making Michael laugh, and that Mrs. Johnson knew exactly how to soothe Sophie during her nighttime colic. Lucy became a constant companion, always eager to include Emily in her activities. They spent hours in the backyard, playing with the twins or just talking under the shade of the big tree in the center of the garden. It was during one of these sunny afternoons that Lucy asked a question that caught Emily by surprise. "Emily," she began absent-mindedly playing with a fallen leaf, "what was it like before? You know, with your real family?" Emily felt her heart skip a beat. She hadn't talked much about her past since arriving at the Johnsons. Part of her wanted to avoid the subject, to pretend that her life had always been like this. But looking at Lucy's curious and caring face, Emily felt a sudden urge to share. "It was different," she said softly, her eyes fixed on Michael and Sophie playing nearby. "When Mom was alive, things were good. She was kind and loving, always singing to us, but after she got sick..." Emily's voice trailed off, the memories flooding back. Lucy scooted closer, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," Lucy said gently. Emily shook her head. "No, it's okay. I think I need to talk about it." She took a deep breath before continuing. "After Mom died, Dad changed. He started drinking a lot. He'd get angry easily, sometimes violent. There were days when we didn't have enough to eat because he'd spent all the money on alcohol." Lucy listened in silence, her eyes wide with sympathy and a hint of shock. "I tried to take care of Michael and Sophie the best I could," Emily continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it got harder and harder. That's when I decided we had to leave." "You're so brave," Lucy said, her voice filled with admiration. "I don't know if I could have done what you did." Emily gave a small, sad smile. "I didn't feel brave. I was terrified, but I knew I had to protect them." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Emily's story hanging in the air. Then Lucy did something unexpected. She leaned over and gave Emily a tight hug. "I'm glad you're here now," Lucy said, her voice muffled against Emily's shoulder. "You're safe here and you're not alone anymore." Emily felt tears prick her eyes, but for once, they weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of relief, of gratitude for this unexpected friendship, and the sense of belonging she was slowly beginning to feel. As they pulled apart, Lucy's face lit up with an idea. "Hey, want to learn how to make friendship bracelets? I can teach you." The sudden change of topic made Emily laugh, a genuine, carefree laugh that surprised even herself. "Sure," she said, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I'd love that." As they gathered supplies and Lucy began explaining the intricate process of weaving the colorful threads, Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest. This moment, so simple and ordinary, felt like a gift. A glimpse of the normal, happy childhood she had thought was lost to her forever. Later that evening, as Emily helped Mrs. Johnson prepare dinner, she found herself humming softly, a habit she had picked up from her mother and lost in the chaos of the past year. Mrs. Johnson noticed, smiling warmly but not commenting, allowing Emily this small, precious moment of rediscovered joy. That night, as Emily lay in bed, her new friendship bracelet on her wrist and the sound of the Johnsons' quiet conversation drifting up from downstairs, she realized something. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time, since losing her mother, Emily felt like she might have found not just a safe place to stay, but a real home. With that comforting thought, she drifted off to sleep, the ghost of a smile on her lips, dreaming of colorful threads weaving together to form something beautiful and unbreakable. The weeks turned into months, and fall gave way to winter. The Johnson's house, once a strange and intimidating place for Emily, was now truly a home. The walls that once seemed cold and impersonal were now decorated with the twins' drawings, family photos, and even some sheet music that Emily had started composing in her guitar lessons with Mr. Johnson. It was a cold and cloudy Saturday afternoon. Emily was sitting on the living room couch, wrapped in a warm blanket, studying for a history test. Michael and Sophie were playing on the rug nearby, under the watchful eye of Mrs. Johnson, who was quietly knitting in an armchair. The sound of the doorbell broke the peace of the afternoon. Emily looked up from her book, curious. They weren't expecting visitors. "I'll get it," Lucy shouted, running down the stairs. Emily turned her attention back to her book, but something in Lucy's tone of voice made her look towards the door again. "Dad, there's someone here asking for Emily," Lucy called, her voice trembling slightly. Mr. Johnson emerged from his study, a worried frown on his forehead. He exchanged a significant look with Mrs. Johnson before heading to the door. Emily felt her heart race. Who could be looking for her? An icy fear began to spread through her body when she heard a familiar voice coming from the entrance. "Where's my daughter?" I know she's here." It was her father's voice. Panic took over Emily. She stood up abruptly, her eyes wide with fear. Mrs. Johnson, sensing her distress, quickly picked up the twins and gestured for Emily to follow her. "Come, dear. Let's go upstairs," she whispered, guiding Emily towards the stairs. But before they could reach them, her father's voice sounded closer. "Emily, I know you're there. Come out now." Emily froze, trembling from head to toe. Painful memories flooded her mind. Screams, broken bottles, nights of hunger and fear. Mr. Johnson appeared in the hallway, his face a mask of determination. "Lisa, take the children upstairs. I'll deal with this." Mrs. Johnson nodded, gently pulling Emily. But Emily couldn't move. Her feet seemed nailed to the floor. "Emily," her father's voice sounded again, closer now. "You can't run forever. I'm your father." Something inside Emily broke at that moment. Years of fear and resentment finally overflowed. With a courage she didn't know she possessed, she took a step forward. "No," she said, her voice trembling, but firm. "You lost the right to be my father the moment you chose drink over us." The silence that followed was deafening. Then her father appeared in the living room entrance. Emily felt Mr. Johnson position himself protectively at her side, while Mrs. Johnson hugged the twins tighter. Carl, Emily's father, looked like a shadow of the man she remembered. His eyes were bloodshot, his face marked by sleepless nights and excessive alcohol. But there was something else in his gaze, a mixture of anger and regret. "Emily," he said, his voice hoarse, I came to take you back, to come home." Emily felt tears burn her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "This is our home now," she replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "This is where we're safe, where we're loved." Carl took a step forward, making Mr. Johnson position himself even more in front of Emily. "You're my children. I have the right—" "The only right you have," Mr. Johnson interrupted, his voice calm but filled with authority, "is to leave this house now. Emily and the twins are under our legal guardianship. If you want to discuss this, you can talk to our lawyer." For a moment it seemed Carl would lunge forward. Emily felt her entire body tense, ready to protect the twins at any cost. But then, something in Carl's eyes changed. It was as if, for the first time in years, he really saw Emily, not as a helpless child, but as a strong and determined young woman. I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I messed everything up, didn't I?" Emily felt a lump in her throat. Part of her wanted to run to her father, hug him and say everything would be okay. But she knew she couldn't. Not now. Maybe never. "Yes, you did," she answered softly. "But there's still time to fix it. Not for us, but for yourself. Get help. Dad, get sober, maybe one day—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning hung in the air. One day maybe they could rebuild some kind of relationship, but not today. Not while alcohol still had control over him. Carl nodded slowly, tears streaming down his marked face. Without saying anything else, he turned and left. The silence that followed was broken only by Emily's soft sobs. Mrs. Johnson immediately enveloped her in a hug, while Mr. Johnson closed the door and joined them. "You were so brave, dear," Mrs. Johnson murmured, stroking Emily's hair. Lucy, who had observed everything in silence, approached with teary eyes. "Emily, are you okay?" Emily took a deep breath, looking at her family. The Johnsons, the twins, Lucy. She wasn't okay, not completely. The encounter with her father had unearthed emotions she thought she had overcome. But she was safe. She was loved. "I will be," she answered honestly. That night, after a quiet but comforting dinner, Emily found herself in the music studio with Mr. Johnson. Without saying a word, he handed her the guitar. Emily began to play, letting her emotions flow through the music. The notes, initially sad and hesitant, gradually transformed into a melody of hope and resilience. When she finished, she looked at Mr. Johnson, surprised to see tears in his eyes. "Emily," he said softly, "you just composed your first complete song." In that moment, Emily realized that despite the pain and challenges, she was growing, evolving, becoming stronger every day. The encounter with her father, although painful, had been a turning point. She was no longer the scared girl who had run away months ago. She was a survivor, an artist, a sister, a daughter. As Mr. Johnson hugged her, Emily felt a sense of peace settle in. The past would always be part of her, but it wouldn't define her. Her future, bright and full of possibilities, was just beginning, and with each note she played, each smile from the twins, each hug from the Johnsons, Emily knew she was on the right path. The path home, the path to herself. Spring arrived, bringing with it not only the blooming of flowers in the Johnsons' garden, but also a blossoming in Emily's life. The months that followed the encounter with her father were of profound transformation and growth. The day dawned sunny, a perfect Saturday for the picnic the family had planned in the local park. Emily woke up early, excited about the prospect of a day outdoors. As she came down the stairs, she was greeted by the aroma of fresh bread and the cheerful sound of the twins babbling in the kitchen. "Good morning, sunshine," Mrs. Johnson greeted, handing Emily a cup of hot chocolate. "Ready for our big day?" Emily smiled, accepting the drink gratefully. "I can't wait," she replied, watching Mr. Johnson cradling the twins while trying, without much success, to prepare sandwiches with one hand. "Hey, Emily!" Lucy entered the kitchen carrying a picnic basket. "Guess who's joining us today?" Before Emily could answer, the doorbell rang. Lucy ran to answer, returning moments later accompanied by Julia, the friend Emily had made on her first day of school. "Hi, Emily," Julia greeted cheerfully. "I hope you don't mind that I accepted the invitation." Emily felt her heart warm. Months ago, the idea of having a friend, let alone one who wanted to spend time with her outside of school, seemed like a distant dream. Now it was her reality. The park was full of families enjoying the sunny day. The Johnsons found a perfect spot under a large tree, spreading out the picnic blanket and organizing the food. Michael and Sophie, now almost 2 years old, ran around on the grass, their laughter echoing in the air. As she watched the scene, Emily felt a wave of gratitude. A year ago, her life was so different, full of fear, uncertainty, and responsibilities too heavy for her young shoulders. Now, here she was, part of a loving family, with friends, and the freedom to simply be a teenager. "What are you thinking about?" Mr. Johnson asked, sitting down next to Emily. She smiled, picking up a sandwich. "About how everything has changed. About how grateful I am for you all." Mr. Johnson put his arm around Emily's shoulders, giving her an affectionate hug. "We're the ones grateful for you, Emily. You've brought so much joy to our family." After lunch, while the adults rested, Emily, Lucy, and Julia decided to take a walk around the park. The three were walking, chatting, and laughing when Emily spotted something that made her stop abruptly. Not far away, sitting on a bench, was her father. Emily's heart raced, a mixture of conflicting emotions flooding her chest. But looking closer, she noticed something different. Her father looked better, healthier. He was reading a book, something Emily hadn't seen him do in years. "Emily, is everything okay?" Julia asked, noticing the sudden change in her friend. Emily took a deep breath, making a decision. "Yes, I need to do something. Can you give me a minute?" Lucy, realizing what was happening, nodded understandingly. "We'll be right here if you need us." With hesitant steps, Emily approached the bench. Her father looked up from his book, surprise evident on his face. "Emily," he said softly, as if he could hardly believe what he was seeing. "Hi, Dad," Emily replied, her voice trembling slightly. There was a moment of tense silence, years of hurt and regret hanging between them. Then her father spoke. I've been sober for 6 months, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I'm in treatment, attending meetings. I wanted to look for you, but I didn't know if I had that right." Emily felt tears forming in her eyes. "I'm happy for you, Dad," she said honestly. "I'm so sorry, Emily," her father continued, tears streaming down his face. "For everything. I know I can't undo what I did, but I'm trying to be better. For myself. For you all." Emily nodded, unable to speak. Part of her wanted to hug him, to say everything would be all right. But another part, the part that still carried the scars of the past, kept her cautious. "It's a start," she finally said. Maybe one day we can try to rebuild something, but it takes time. Her father nodded, understanding. I understand. And I'll wait as long as necessary. I just want you to know that I'm proud of you, Emily. You're stronger than I ever was. With a heavy heart, but somehow lighter, Emily said goodbye and returned to where Lucy and Julia were waiting. The friends hugged her silently, offering comfort without words. Back at the picnic, Emily shared the encounter with the Johnsons. Their reaction was one of support and understanding, reaffirming that they would be by her side, regardless of what the future held. Later that night, after a dinner filled with lively conversations and laughter, Emily found herself in the music studio. Her fingers danced over the guitar strings, creating a melody that spoke of pain, hope, and renewal. Mr. Johnson appeared in the doorway, silently observing for a moment before entering. "That's new," he commented, sitting down next to Emily. "Inspired by today's events?" Emily nodded. "It's about growing up, about forgiving but not forgetting, about finding strength in unexpected places." Mr. Johnson smiled, proud. "You know, Emily, when you came here, you were a girl carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. Now I see a strong, talented, and compassionate young woman. You've grown so much." Emily felt the tears return, but this time they were tears of gratitude and joy. "It's thanks to you all. You gave me a home, a family. You showed me what unconditional love is. And you taught us about resilience, courage, and the power of sibling love," Mr. Johnson replied, hugging her. "We're all stronger together." That night, lying in her bed, Emily reflected on the day. The encounter with her father, though emotionally charged, hadn't shaken her as she feared. Instead, she felt stronger, more secure in who she was and where she belonged. Looking at the crib where Michael and Sophie slept peacefully, Emily made a silent promise. She would be the sister they deserved, the daughter the Johnsons had welcomed with open arms, and the friend Lucy and Julia could rely on. But above all, she would be true to herself, to the girl who faced unimaginable adversities and emerged, stronger, wiser, and full of love. The future was still uncertain in many ways. The relationship with her father was a long and delicate path to be traveled. But Emily was no longer afraid. She had a family, friends, and an inner strength that no one could take away from her. As sleep enveloped her, Emily smiled. The melody she had composed earlier echoed in her mind, a song of hope and possibilities. It was the music of her life, and she could hardly wait to see what notes the future would bring. Summer arrived with all its intensity, bringing with it not only the scorching heat, but also a wave of changes in Emily's life. The school year had ended, and with it came the promise of 2 months of vacation full of possibilities. It was a particularly hot Saturday morning when Emily woke up to the sound of laughter coming from the garden. Looking out the window, she saw Michael and Sophie playing in the small inflatable pool that Mr. Johnson had set up the night before. The scene made her smile. Her siblings, now almost 2.5 years old, were growing up so fast and full of life. Going down the stairs, Emily was greeted by the aroma of freshly made waffles and the sound of soft music coming from the kitchen. Mrs. Johnson was dancing distractedly while preparing breakfast, pausing only to give Emily an affectionate kiss on the cheek. "Good morning, dear. Did you sleep well?" Emily nodded, grabbing a still warm waffle. "Yes, thank you. Where is everyone?" "Lucy left early for a summer camp, remember? And David is in the garden with the children." Mrs. Johnson paused, an enigmatic smile on her lips. "Actually, he was waiting for you to wake up. He has a surprise for you." Intrigued, Emily quickly finished her breakfast and headed to the garden. Mr. Johnson was sitting in a beach chair, closely watching the twins in the pool. "Good morning, Emily," he greeted her cheerfully. "Come sit here, I have something to show you." Emily settled into the chair next to him, curious. Mr. Johnson took an envelope from his shirt and handed it to her. "What is this?" she asked, turning the envelope in her hands. "Open it," he encouraged, his eyes shining with expectation. Carefully, Emily opened the envelope and removed the contents. It was a colorful brochure with the title New York Youth Music Festival stamped on top. "A music festival?" Emily asked, her eyebrows rising in surprise. Mr. Johnson nodded enthusiastically. "It's not just a festival, It's a competition for young composers, and I think you should participate." Emily felt her heart race. In recent months, her passion for music had grown exponentially. With Mr. Johnson's patient guidance, she had honed her guitar skills and begun composing her own songs. But the idea of presenting her music to a larger audience was both exciting and terrifying. I don't know," she hesitated. "Do you think—" "I'm ready." Mr. Johnson placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Emily, over the past few months, I've seen you grow not only as a musician, but as a person. Your compositions are profound, exciting, and true. I think the world deserves to hear them." His words touched Emily deeply. She looked at the brochure, again imagining herself on stage, sharing her music, her story with others. "What if I'm not good enough?" she whispered, giving voice to her deepest fears. "Dear," Mr. Johnson said gently, "it's not about being the best. It's about sharing. Your voice, your unique perspective. Besides," he added with a smile, "the prize includes a scholarship to a music conservatory." Emily's eyes widened. A scholarship? The possibility of pursuing her musical dreams more seriously was something she had barely dared to dream of. "Okay," she finally said, a smile spreading across her face. "I'll do it." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Emily spent hours in the music studio, composing, practicing, perfecting. The music she was creating was a sonic tapestry of her journey, from the initial fear and despair to the hope and love she found with the Johnsons. The whole family got involved in the project. Lucy helped choose the perfect outfit for the performance. Mrs. Johnson prepared special snacks to keep Emily energized during long practice sessions, and even the twins contributed in their own way, offering hugs and encouraging smiles when Emily felt frustrated. A week before the festival, Emily received an unexpected visit. Her father, still in recovery but visibly better than the last time she had seen him, appeared at the Johnsons' door. "I heard about the festival," he said timidly. I'd like to be there if you'll allow it." Emily felt a lump in her throat. Her relationship with her father was still fragile, a delicate balance between the painful past and the hope for a better future. But seeing him make an effort, wanting to be part of her life, meant a lot. "I'd like that," she answered softly. The day of the festival finally arrived. Emily was backstage, her heart beating so hard she was sure everyone around her could hear. Her guitar, a gift from Mr. Johnson a few months ago, seemed to weigh a ton in her hands. "5 minutes, Emily," a stage assistant warned her. Taking a deep breath, Emily closed her eyes, trying to calm herself. At that moment, she felt familiar hands on her shoulders. Opening her eyes, she found herself surrounded by her family, the Johnsons, Lucy, the twins, and even her father, all smiling encouragingly. "You're going to rock," Lucy whispered, giving her a tight hug. "We're so proud of you," Mrs. Johnson added, tears shining in her eyes. Mr. Johnson said nothing, just hugged her tightly, conveying all his support and confidence in that gesture. Her father, looking a bit out of place but determined, stepped forward. "Emily, I just want you to know that no matter what happens out there, you're already a winner in my eyes." Those words, coming from the man who had for so long been the source of her fear and pain, were what Emily needed to find. Her courage. "Emily Johnson, you're next," the assistant called. With one last look at her family, both blood and given by life, Emily walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, the audience a sea of unknown faces. But there, in the front row, were the people who mattered most. Emily adjusted the microphone, positioned the guitar, and with a confident smile began to play. The first notes flowed smoothly, telling the story of a lost and frightened girl. As the music progressed, it grew in intensity and emotion, speaking of challenges overcome, of love found in unexpected places, of a family built not just by blood ties but by choice and love. When the last note echoed through the auditorium, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then, like a wave, the audience erupted into applause. Emily opened her eyes, which she hadn't realized she had closed, to see the audience standing, many with tears in their eyes. Later, After the award ceremony where Emily received first place and the much-dreamed-of scholarship, she found herself surrounded by her expanded family. Hugs, kisses, and words of pride were freely shared. "You did it, my star," Mr. Johnson said, his voice choked with emotion. Emily looked at everyone around her, the Johnsons who had welcomed her and given her a home, Lucy who had become the sister she never had, the twins for whom she had fought so desperately, and her father who was making a genuine effort to redeem himself. At that moment, Emily realized that her victory wasn't just on stage. It was a victory over fear, over the past, over the circumstances that had threatened to engulf her. "No," she replied, smiling through tears. "We did it. All of us." And there, surrounded by love and possibilities, Emily knew that her journey was far from over. In fact, it was just the beginning of a new and exciting symphony. Fall arrived again, bringing with it a cool breeze and the start of a new chapter in Emily's life. After her victory at the Youth Music Festival, things had changed rapidly. The scholarship she had won opened doors that Emily had never imagined possible. It was a Monday morning, and the Johnsons' house was in an uproar. Today was Emily's first day at the New York Conservatory of Music, one of the most prestigious institutions in the country. Emily stood in front of the mirror, nervously adjusting the strap of her new backpack. The reflection staring back at her was of a confident young woman, so different from the frightened girl who had arrived at the Johnsons' house just over a year ago. "Emily, breakfast is on the table." Mrs. Johnson's voice sounded from downstairs. With one last look in the mirror and a deep sigh, Emily descended the stairs. The kitchen was a whirlwind of activity. Mr. Johnson was preparing sandwiches for lunch. Lucy was trying to feed the twins, now almost 3 years old and full of energy, and Mrs. Johnson was serving freshly made pancakes. "Good morning, Rockstar," Mr. Johnson joked, handing Emily a wrapped sandwich. "Ready to conquer the world of music?" Emily laughed, but her stomach did a somersault of nervousness. "I think so," she replied, grabbing a pancake. Mrs. Johnson approached, affectionately adjusting the collar of Emily's blouse. "You're going to do wonderfully well, dear. Remember, you earned your place there. You deserve this." The words of encouragement helped calm Emily's nerves, but not completely. This was a whole new world for her, full of possibilities, but also of unknown challenges. After breakfast, as Emily prepared to leave, Michael and Sophie ran up to her, their little faces serious. "Emmy going way?" Michael asked, his big eyes full of concern. Emily's heart melted. Kneeling down to be at the twins' level, she hugged them tightly. "Just for a few hours, little ones. I promise I'll be back to play with you later." Sophie, always the more expressive of the two, gave Emily a wet kiss on the cheek. "Bring music for us?" Emily laughed, wiping away a stubborn tear. "Of course. Princess, I'll bring lots of music for you." With one last hug to the whole family, Emily set off on her new adventure. The conservatory was an imposing building, with its classic architecture and corridors that echoed with melodies from various instruments. Emily felt small and a little lost as she navigated the hallways, looking for her first class. As she turned a corner, she collided with someone dropping her sheet music on the floor. "Oh, sorry," she exclaimed, bending down to collect the papers. "It's okay, it was my fault too," replied a male voice. Emily looked up and found herself face to face with a pair of smiling green eyes. The boy, who appeared to be about her age, had messy dark hair and a guitar hanging on his back. "I'm Peter," he introduced himself, extending his hand to help her up. "You're new here, aren't you? I've never seen you before." Emily nodded, feeling her cheeks blush slightly. "Yes, I'm Emily. It's my first day." "Oh, cool. What instrument do you play?" "Guitar," Emily replied, feeling a little more at ease. "And you?" Peter smiled, patting his own guitar. "We're instrument buddies then. Hey, what's your first class? I can show you where it is if you want." Grateful for the friendly offer, Emily showed her schedule to Peter. To her surprise and relief, she discovered that they would share several classes. As the day progressed, Emily found herself immersed in a world of music theory, advanced guitar techniques, and music history. It was challenging, sometimes overwhelming, but also incredibly exciting. Each new piece of information, each chord, Learned made her heart sing. During lunch, Peter introduced her to his group of friends, Maria, a talented pianist, Lucas, a passionate violinist, and Anna, a vocalist with an angelic voice. Sitting with them in the cafeteria, sharing stories and laughter, Emily felt a sense of belonging that went beyond her adoptive family. The last class of the day was composition, Emily's favorite. The teacher, a gray-haired gentleman with kind eyes, asked each student to share a bit about their musical journey. When it was Emily's turn, she hesitated for a moment. Her story wasn't conventional, and part of her feared judgment from her classmates. But then, remembering Mr. Johnson's words about the importance of being authentic in her art, she took a deep breath and began to speak. Emily told about her difficult childhood, about how music became her refuge. She talked about running away from home with her twin siblings, about finding a new family and rediscovering her passion for music. As she spoke, her voice gained confidence, and she could see the impact of her words on the attentive faces of her classmates. When she finished, there was a moment of silence in the room. Then, to her surprise, her classmates began to applaud. The teacher, with tears in his eyes, approached. "Emily, my young lady," he said gently, "you have a powerful story to tell, and I'm sure your music will be equally powerful." At the end of the day, exhausted but happy, Emily said goodbye to her new friends and made her way back home. Her head was full of new melodies, techniques, and ideas for compositions. Arriving home, she was greeted by enthusiastic hugs from the twins and anxious questions from the whole family about how her day had been. During dinner, as she shared her experiences, Emily realized something important. The conservatory wasn't just a place to learn music. It was a place where she could continue her journey of self-discovery and healing. Later, in the house's music studio, Emily sat down with her guitar. Her hands danced over the strings, creating a melody that spoke of new beginnings, blossoming friendships, and dreams becoming reality. Mr. Johnson, hearing the music, appeared in the studio doorway. "Sounds like someone had a good day," he commented with a smile. Emily looked at him, her eyes shining with emotion and gratitude. "It was amazing," she said. "And you know what? I think I finally understood what you always say about music being a universal language." Mr. Johnson nodded, proud. "And you, my dear, are just beginning to master that language. I can't wait to see and hear what you'll create next." As the months passed, Emily flourished at the conservatory. Her natural talent, combined with her unique life experiences, gave her music a depth and authenticity that impressed both her teachers and peers. She formed close friendships with Peter, Maria, Lucas, and Anna, finding in them kindred spirits who shared her passion for music. At home, life with the Johnsons continued to be a source of love and support. The twins were growing fast, their personalities blossoming. Michael was showing an early interest in music, often trying to strum Emily's guitar, while Sophie was developing a love for dance, twirling around the living room to whatever melody Emily played. One evening, as Emily was working on a new composition in the studio, she heard a soft knock on the door. It was her father. "Hey, kiddo," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "Your mom, Mrs. Johnson, said I could find you here. Is it okay if I come in?" Emily nodded, gesturing for him to enter. Their relationship had been slowly improving over the past few months. Her father had remained sober, attending regular AA meetings and therapy sessions. While the wounds of the past weren't fully healed, they were learning to build a new kind of relationship. "I wanted to hear what you're working on," he said, sitting down on a nearby chair, "if that's all right with you." Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She began to play, her fingers dancing over the strings as she poured her heart into the music. The melody was complex, weaving together themes of loss, hope, and redemption. As the last notes faded away, Emily looked up to see tears in her father's eyes. "That was beautiful, Emily," he said, his voice choked with emotion. I'm so sorry for all the years I missed, for not being there to see you become this amazing young woman." Emily felt her own eyes welling up. "Dad, No. Let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I know I can never make up for the past, but I want you to know how proud I am of you, How grateful I am that you've given me a chance to be part of your life again." Emily set her guitar aside and for the first time in years hugged her father tightly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step towards healing. As summer approached again, bringing with it the end of Emily's first year at the conservatory, the Johnsons decided to organize a big celebration. It wasn't just for Emily's academic achievements, but a celebration of family, of second chances, of the power of love and music to heal and unite. The backyard was decorated with fairy lights, and tables were set up for a feast. Emily's friends from the conservatory were there, along with neighbors, teachers, and even some of the staff from the shelter, where Emily and the twins had first found refuge. As twilight fell, Mr. Johnson called for everyone's attention. "We're here today to celebrate not just Emily's incredible achievements this past year, but the journey that brought us all together. Emily, would you like to play something for us?" Emily nodded, picking up her guitar. As she began to play, she looked around at the faces of those gathered. There was Lucy, her sister in every way that mattered. The twins, Michael and Sophie, dancing together in their own uncoordinated but joyful way. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, the parents who had opened their hearts and home to her. Her father, sober and present, a small smile on his face. Her friends from the conservatory who had become like family. The melody she played was one of hope and gratitude. As the final notes faded, applause erupted from the gathering. Emily smiled, feeling a sense of belonging and purpose she had once thought impossible. "Thank you all for being here," she said, her voice strong and clear. "A year ago, I couldn't have imagined this moment. But thanks to the love, support, and second chances I've been given, I'm here. And I'm excited for what the future holds." As the party continued into the night, filled with laughter, music, and the warmth of family and friends, Emily knew that her journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, new heights to reach, and more music to create. But she was ready to face it all, surrounded by the love and support of her chosen family. The story of Emily, Michael, and Sophie, once lost and afraid, had transformed into a symphony of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of love. And as Emily looked up at the star-filled sky, she knew that this was just the beginning of their beautiful melody. If this story touched you, consider supporting us with a donation here on YouTube through the Super Thanks option. What may be little to you means a lot to us, and we will keep creating more stories.